Southwest Queensland flooding, 6th January to 23rd January. Western New South Wales storms and floods, 6th January onwards.
It's a rare day when Australia doesn't have a disaster unfolding somewhere.
Clarence Valley bushfire, 21st January to 13th February.
Granted, it's a big place, but incidents of extreme weather events are on the increase all over the world.
Attribution studies have confirmed that those extreme events have been many times more likely because of global warming. So the climate change impacts that were predicted are here, and all of these seems to be accelerating.
Professor Tommy Wiedmann there, confirming our worst inklings.
Tasmania East Coast severe weather event, 21st February onwards. Tropical low and associated flooding in East Pilbara, 4th to 11th March.
What you've been hearing in the background here is a log of all the disasters that have taken place so far this year, read by Australia's longest-serving weather presenter, Jenny Woodward.
Western Queensland rainfall and flooding, 22nd of March to the 20th of April.
This online record kept by the Department of Home Affairs includes a helpful sorting feature. It lists the type of events they're tracking: storms, floods, hail, tornado, bushfire, earthquakes, landslides, even meteorite strikes make an appearance. But there is something missing. And that something is the heat wave.
It's great for the swimming.
Just beach, lots of sunscreen, lots of water.
Yeah, it's nice.
You've just got to get the right formula, and that includes beach, water and shade.
We love it.
Heat, we love it. Can't get enough of it, right? Bring on summer. Woo! Yes, I want to sizzle under that summer sun. But do we take heat seriously enough? Is Australia's best friend really our worst enemy? I'm Dan Illich, and this is Preppers, a podcast about climate change preparedness, where we ask the question, are we getting ready hard and fast enough for the climate changes that are coming? In this episode, as each month that passes goes down as the hottest on record, should we all put heat at the top of our threat assessment matrix and prepare for it to get a whole lot worse? Historically, the money we've dropped on disaster recovery has outweighed preparedness spending by almost 100 to 1. Lately, the government has twigged that if we spend a little bit more on preparation, less will go out the door when the shit hits the fan. As a nod to this change of heart, the name of the former federal government's Emergency Response Fund has been changed to the Disaster Ready Fund. You see what they did there? Crafty. Clever. We're not responding, we're getting ready! But what does this makeover mean in real terms? Well, the Disaster Ready Fund has quadrupled the preparedness budget from $50 to $200 million per year for the next 5 years. Top-ups from the states and territories will bring that annual spend closer to $400 million. Sounds pretty decent, but when you consider the $3 billion we spend on direct disaster recovery and the knock-on cost to the economy of $18.2 billion per year, that $400 million starts to look less like a delicious ice cream cake and more like a boiled lolly that's been booting around the bottom of your grandmother's purse for the last 15 years. Okay, but before we get carried away, let's not look this gift horse too closely in the mouth. After all, the first round of the Disaster Ready Fund rolled out in 2023, which means prepping projects are underway all over the country right now. 187 grants have been awarded for the kinds of projects you'd expect to see. Upgrading water bombing tanks, maintenance of seawalls, better hazard warning systems, flood levee design, that kind of sort of stuff. So a big focus on fire and floods with a sprinkling of other things depending on the part of the country you're in. A bigger and better pollen forecasting system for Victoria. An up-to-standard cyclone shelter for Palm Island in Queensland. Heat does appear on the list this time. Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria have projects that focus on assessing or reducing the impact of heat waves. But if it's not something the whole country is prioritising, just how big of a problem can heat really be?
Heat waves in Australia kill more Australians than all other natural disasters combined. So in Australia, they're our deadliest natural hazard.
Professor Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick is a climate scientist with ANU and an expert in heat waves. And in case you didn't catch that, heat waves kill more Australians than all other natural disasters combined.
And on top of that, it's insidious, so you don't necessarily die of heat. It might exacerbate an underlying medical condition that you have or cause heart failure or hypothermia. because of your body's response to those extreme conditions. So it's not necessarily something that's measured directly, but it has a very big impact on health in Australia.
A heatwave occurs when the minimum and maximum temperatures are unusually hot for a period of 3 or more days. The total of excess deaths recorded during heat waves number in the hundreds. That means many more people die during periods of extreme heat than otherwise would.
So the most vulnerable to the health effects of heat waves are basically the old, the young, so your really young babies as well, and anyone with an underlying medical condition. That's certainly who's most vulnerable now, but that may also start to shift to include young, healthy, fit people in the next few decades as well, as we start to reach those really, really severe conditions.
It's not just health impacts and death rates that show an upward trend during heat waves. A recent study by Macquarie University found that rates of domestic violence also increase when the temperature spikes. And research out of the US has observed that the rate of hate tweets are at their highest on hotter days. Across the globe, the number of people exposed to heat waves has increased in the last couple of decades by 125 million. That's a lot of irrationally angry and very, very hot people. The news that 2023 was the hottest year on record won't have come as a crashing surprise.
All 22,000 residents of Yellowknife in Canada's Northwest Territories have been ordered to leave.
For 4 days, the Evros region has been battling fires on multiple fronts.
Shanghai authorities declared an orange heat alert.
Phoenix in Arizona has now done 16 days where the temperature has been above 43 degrees.
Grief and anger growing over what could be Hawaii's deadliest natural disaster.
So you really only need to shift the average temperature by, less than 1 degree Celsius, and you'll see a huge increase in the frequency and intensity of extremes. And that's precisely what we've seen. The globe is warmed by just under 1.5 degrees Celsius now. And you can see the drastic changes we've already seen in their frequency, intensity, and duration, basically everywhere in the world. And that's looking at data that dates back to at least 1950, sometimes a lot earlier.
1950, the same year that car ownership in Australia jumped by 68%. Oil-fueled post-war consumerism and its advertising juggernauts took hold of our throats and eyeballs and earholes and wallets, and they haven't let go. As a direct result, the number of extremely warm days we have experienced here in Australia has increased threefold in just the last 20 years. So how much worse is it going to get?
I can't provide a forecast saying that, in January 2070, Sydney will see a heat wave that's 52 degrees Celsius. We just can't do that. It's not what climate science and understanding extremes in the context of climate change is all about. But we can say, for example, that over Sydney, we've seen temperatures, particularly in the west, reach near 50 degrees in the recent past. It's very probable that heat waves in the middle or towards the end of this century could very well exceed those sorts of temperatures.
The latest intergenerational report, that's the one where the government dusts off its crystal ball and tries to predict what the impact of today's policy will be on Australia in 40 years' time. That report predicted that there will be 3 times the number of 80-year-olds in Australia in 40 years' time than there are today. And I, dear listener, will be one of them. An officially vulnerable old man who might have eaten too many kebabs in his day, a sitting duck for heat, and garlic sauce. Heat is one of those tricky things, like eating snails, jumping off cliffs for fun. You might think about it differently depending on where you live and what you're accustomed to. While 30 degrees in Hobart might see everyone melting into their shoes, for a place like Dubbo on the western plains of New South Wales, even 40 degrees isn't really considered a hot day.
It's 29 degrees right now. I dare say it'll continue to climb. We have seen days well into the 40s, though, over the last couple of weeks.
Liv Stevenson is sitting by the sparkling waters of the Dubbo pool, which she manages along with the aquatic facilities in the towns of Geary and Wellington.
This is where everyone comes when it's hot. While it is chaotic, while the lines get long and the pools get full, that's exactly how we like it.
The Dubbo Leisure Centre is well equipped to deal with crowds on a hot day, with water slides, a big water playground and plenty of shade. So it's a no-brainer that attracts people from across the whole region.
With those smaller towns, they have even less access. So they will get in the car for half an hour to drive here to give the kids something to do while it's hot.
The pool isn't the only place that Dubboites make a beeline for on a hot day.
We have the air conditioning company on speed dial because for us overall, if something's wrong with the air conditioning, everybody goes, we've got a problem.
Catherine McAllister is the Macquarie Regional Library Manager.
One aspect of the public library is that everyone can come. They could sit here all day if they want, but certainly the vulnerable parts of the community benefit the most from having a council facility that gives them some respite from whatever the environmental conditions are.
Like I said, heat is relative. For Catherine, a hot day is 40, 42 degrees.
But once you get around 36, 37, that's pretty warm, and the library is a beautiful, cool place on a day like that, as you can see today.
The Dubbo Regional Council has been doing a lot of thinking about what the future holds for a place that's already seeing its fair share of heat waves.
I grew up in Dubbo. I love Dubbo.
Tim Howlett is the team leader of growth planning projects for Dubbo Regional Council.
We want Dubbo to be a place that everyone enjoys living, working and playing. It's not necessarily the best environment to live in if it's too hot and you can't really do anything.
Tim's particular concern is how to deal with a growing population in the growing heat. The current growth rate for the city is about 1% per year, but Dubbo is captured in the 20,000 kilometre area earmarked by the state government for its first renewable energy zone. The zone will see the construction of new transmission infrastructure along with wind and solar farms to feed into it. It's expected to bring in about $10 billion in private investment to the Central West region by 2030.
Approximately going to have about 5,000 to 7,000 construction jobs at its peak. So we do want to convert some of that employment into permanent residence.
How to grow a city that can cope with the increasing rates of heat waves is a challenging problem. So, when the researchers from the High Performance Architecture project team at UNSW reached out to Dubbo Council, it couldn't have come at a better time. The university offered Dubbo a place in a pilot program, which would see the implementation and testing of the National Heat Vulnerability Observatory. The aim of the project is to measure Dubbo's vulnerability to heat and help them figure out what to do about it.
It's a very exciting project because we know that urban heat is a big challenge. So what we are doing, we really want to work with state and local governments to tackle this challenge.
Associate Professor Lan Ding is the National Heat Vulnerability Observatory, or NAVO, project lead.
The Heat Observatory provides index. So it provides consistent and integrated approach to measuring and reporting heat vulnerability issues. At the moment, there are too many studies, in particular case studies have been done, but there is a lack of integrated and consistent approach to reporting and measuring urban heat vulnerability risk.
When I say National Heat Vulnerability Observatory, you might start imagining domed roof buildings with scientific implements pointed at the sky. But NAVO actually takes the form of a website which sucks in a huge amount of data from the local area and transforms it into a map-based, colour-coded heat tracking and busting digital tool. With a few clicks, decision makers can quickly understand how vulnerable their communities are and what they can do about it.
Local government really want to understand the mitigation option to support their planning control. Are there cooling intervention options? And how those technology can be utilized? And how these scientific outcomes can help them?
One of the cooling interventions Lan is referring to has been dubbed super cool materials. Instead of building a house with dark roof tiles and bricks which absorb the heat of the sun, this new generation of materials reflect that heat by quite a bit. When researchers measured the surface temperature of cool materials on a sunny 42-degree day, they were just 25 degrees. Wow, that is pretty impressive. Dare I say, super cool. And if super cool materials are combined with other cooling strategies like planting trees, it's estimated that the reduction in heat could save around 10 lives per 100,000 people a year. And that's what the NAVO project is all about. Having teamed up with UNSW, Dubbo Council selected two areas which would be the focus for the NAVO pilot: South Dubbo and South Lakes.
We've looked at both a well-developed area and an area that's being developed. So it'll be interesting to see, as development occurs, what the what the data is showing.
The project kicked off with UNSW students visiting the case study precincts with handheld temperature sensors to get some baseline readings.
In November 2023, drones were flown over those precincts to get more detailed information and heat mapping for where the hotspots are. And temperature sensors were installed on street signs, street poles in those precincts as well to capture data over the extended period of time. So we're going to South Dubbo, which is one of the precincts where the temperature sensors have been installed. South Dubbo is our existing built-up area, and South Lakes is a newly developed and developing suburb.
Driving through the streets of his town, Tim asks the tough questions.
Can you ever have too many pubs? So this sensor that we're looking at in South Dubbo, it's attached to a parking sign out the front of a childcare centre.
This sensor is one of 6 in the South Dubbo precinct. It looks a bit like an upside-down stack of dinner plates, but it's collecting a continuous stream of real-time temperature data and uploading it to the cloud.
It's very technical and I don't understand it, which is good because we've got the university involved to interpret it for us.
Back at UNSW in Sydney, Dr. William Craft, one of the NAVO team, is busy doing just that. He's pulled the temperature data from the cloud and entered it into a spreadsheet, which contains all the information that will feed into the Heat Vulnerability Observatory.
So what you're seeing here on the left is all of the data that we've collected across a range of different categories that are used to determine and predict the heat vulnerability across the thermal, energy and health aspects of our heat vulnerability index.
This spreadsheet is the font of all heat vulnerability knowledge. It pulls data in from all over the place to create a digital twin of the case study areas. It contains everything from travel time to the nearest hospital through to how much energy households use on a hot day. And not forgetting the temperature data, which comes not just from the on-the-ground sensors and drones, but from the Bureau of Meteorology heatwave classification system.
So you can see here, for example, for South Lakes, in this particular month, we had 10 heatwave days, and we can also categorise the severity of that heatwave.
Taken together, this very rich set of data creates a detailed picture of how vulnerable each case study precinct is. But, you know, spreadsheets aren't to everyone's taste, and this one has so many data points, it can make your eyes fall out of your head. And that's where the Heat Vulnerability Observatory comes into its own.
So we're trying to present the data in a way that's a little bit more user-friendly so that people that aren't data scientists can extract meaning and they can inform their decisions based on actual data.
NAVO has a very friendly-looking interface, which you can navigate by clicking on the colour-coded map of a city.
So our ranking from 1 to 10 is colour-coded from blue through to green to yellow to orange to red to clearly enable users of our index to visualise very quickly and easily where are the areas that are most vulnerable to heat. So for example, I've clicked on South Lakes here, just the month of January in 2020. We can see thermal has an index value of 9, which is red, which is quite high. We have a vulnerability index value for health of 9 as well, and then an energy index value of 8. This particular area uses quite a bit of energy at a household level during this particular month.
Yeah, so the paddock that we're currently looking at, it's got a development application in for approximately 650 lots.
Driving around South Lakes with Tim, it's not hard to see why it's an area that's vulnerable to heat. It's a typical new housing development. Lots of single-storey, 3-bedroom houses on blocks that butt right up against each other, very exposed to the sun.
So currently looking at newly constructed houses, predominantly brick veneer housing that all have dark roofs. All the houses behind us as well have dark roofs. A lot of the houses have brown bricks as well. Given this is a new area, the trees are only 1 to 2 metres high at the moment. They'll eventually grow taller, but that won't happen anytime soon.
As we make our way past the lines of newly planted saplings, it's interesting to think that they also live a digital life in the tree canopy column of William's spreadsheet.
At the moment, we've got it at 1% because the trees are still developing and still growing.
We can understand exactly how many dark roofs there are.
Approximately 65% of the dwellings across this area in South Lakes having dark roofs.
And when it comes to factors like health and income, which have a bearing on the number of hospital presentations, or whether someone can even afford to turn on the air conditioning, being this specific starts to make a lot of sense.
We have 19% of people considered vulnerable due to their age, 3% classified as a low-income household.
Pretty much the only thing missing from this data set is what Brian in 147 ate for breakfast. So now we know what the heat vulnerability score is. What do we do about it?
Then what we have done is run different scenarios using computational fluid dynamics.
Ah, yes, computational fluid dynamics. Do go on, Doctor.
So it's a very complex simulation software that we can use to then run hypothetical what-if scenarios. For example, if we take this South Lakes area, we have here over on the right some of the different mitigation scenarios that we've integrated.
The different mitigation scenarios are a list of strategies that council might employ to reduce heat. These include things like introducing water misting, using super cool building materials, or increasing greenery.
So if we were to click on increase greenery, where we have increased the number of street trees, the colour dropped. So we had a thermal ranking or value of 9. Once we clicked on increase greenery, so running our simulation, we see that thermal index value can drop to an 8. If we are then to click on the combination of different strategies, so potentially throwing everything that we can on it, we can see it drops even further to 7, which is an orange colour rather than a red. So that's kind of the end goal here is targeted at interventions and what we can do to prevent either heat getting worse or how we can adapt to it or build new communities that don't make heat any worse.
These mitigation strategies can reduce surface temperatures by as much as 10 degrees. But when William talks about dropping an area like South Lakes from red to orange, it can mean by as little as a 1 or 2 degree difference, which after all this effort just doesn't sound like much.
When we consider larger scales, a reduction of 1 degree can be quite significant across a large geographical area. When we're talking about extreme heat, it can have a huge impact on the health outcomes of a particular person. It also highlights the fact that there's only so much we can do. I read something the other day that 15 cities throughout Western Australia were the hottest places in the world on that day. So it's only going to get worse, and some places are going to become basically uninhabitable, which is why it's so important to do what we can right now. And it may not seem like much, but all of these little actions do add up. We just have to be as prepared as we possibly can for the future.
When it comes to heat, Will and Sarah are singing from the same hymn sheet.
Best case scenario when it comes to heat waves 80 odd years from now is that they don't change much. And that would ultimately happen if we basically stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow. And that would just mean that they would be what they are now and just continue as they are for the next 100 or more years. The worst case scenario is that we continue emitting greenhouse gases at the rate that we are. And unfortunately, this is probably one of the most likely scenarios. And we just basically see heat waves increase on average by a few degrees Celsius in terms of their intensity and just get longer. It's really hard to put actual figures around how long these heat waves may be. But one thing's for certain, the heat waves that we've experienced now mean nothing compared to what's to come in the future. We should be making changes basically now in terms of how we live and cope within heat waves. But I just don't think it's clear to most people how urgent making those changes are. We don't have any time left to lose.
Dubbo is awaiting the full results of the pilot study before they develop a plan for heat-proofing the city. In the meantime, plenty more councils are already knocking on Land's door, interested in having their cities added to the observatory. The goal is to scale up. Land has her sights on 21 Australian cities. The more cities, the more data, the more meaningful and useful the tool will be. The case for prepping for heat waves seems pretty clear. But as with so many things, there's a catch. Because when our brains and budgets get busy preparing for the impacts of climate change, our focus can be drawn away from fixing the underlying problem.
The more we implement adaptation policies and solutions, the more we postpone the fundamental mitigation policies, right?
Giovanni Cucino is a PhD candidate in the UNSW Business School. Just like climate scientists use computer simulations to model climate change, Giovanni uses computer simulations to model how humans behave when confronted with climate change. His research has found that adaptation or preparedness can be a bit of a double-edged sword.
When we implement adaptation policies, we create this side effect that we decrease the perception of the severity of climate change. What happens is that we put ourselves in a very risky pathway because we will become more and more dependent on adaptation. Since we don't put into place fundamental solution fixing the root causes of the problem, climate change will just get worse and worse, making us, on the one hand, more dependent on adaptation, because if we stop adapting, we'll perceive so much the extreme consequences of extreme events, we cannot stop it. So we will end up in a situation in which we have so many, so frequent extreme events that all our resources and efforts will be focused on that. And it's a trap, because once you get there, you cannot get out anymore.
To avoid getting trapped in this feedback loop, we have some choices to make.
So when we talk about fundamental solutions, we refer to mitigation. And there are two types of mitigation we can implement. Humanity entirely can develop technological solutions that allow us to keep our lifestyle based on consumerism, but at the same time completely reduce, almost towards zero, the amount of emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
If this pathway sounds familiar, it's because it's the one we're on right now. The renewables rollout is far and away the biggest show in town. The pitch is that we transition to solar and wind, we buy electric cars, we get rid of our gas cooktops, and life continues more or less as it does now, which is where the problem of time starts rearing its ever-present head.
Because assume we invest out of billions of dollars today for developing green technologies. It will take decades to develop them and then decades to implement them. So this is the first pathway. The second one is that people change their behavior and basically we consume less, because consuming less means polluting less. That's the simple equation. The good thing of changing our habits, becoming more sustainable, is that we will have a positive effect on the environment today. And what we found is that what drives people's decision is their perception of climate change. And when we implement adaptation policies, we create this side effect that we decrease the perception of the severity of climate change. We perceive there's still time, and that's the tricky part.
It's no surprise that many of us are under the impression that we still have time. Sure, there are hurdles to overcome, but there are things in motion. Electric cars will get cheaper. The new grid will be built. The economy will transform and we'll reach our net zero goals in time. Right? Right? Is that happening? But even if we believe Australia is on track, and it is a big if, this is an international effort, and not everyone agrees that we'll get to where we need to be. In fact, a growing number of scientists say we are simply too late and too slow, and we're already bumping into 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It's at this point geoengineers step into the fray. While Lan and her team at UNSW are working locally to reduce heat, there are researchers all over the world attempting to design technologies that could work at a global scale to cool the Earth. One crazy idea is the idea of a sunshade, roughly the size of Argentina, which would be unfurled in space to filter the amount of solar energy that reaches our atmosphere, thus reducing the temperature. I can't see any problems with that. That sounds perfectly fine. They'd probably get someone very reputable to build it, like someone like Boeing. Other plans involve flying aircraft around the various layers of the atmosphere, spraying huge quantities of particulates into the air with the aim of increasing cloud cover to reflect the sun's heat back into space. Now, it might sound like Elon Musk has been let loose in the geotech candy store, but there are serious people all over the world spending serious time and serious money developing these projects very seriously. And while they may show theoretical promise, they'll cost billions to implement, and no one really knows if any of it will work.
So basically what we're doing is that we are betting on our infinite ability to develop technologies that can protect us. And we are risking our necks, because what if we reach a ceiling and then we cannot adapt anymore? And this is just a global bet. It could work or not. We just don't know.
Professor Tommy Wiedmann agrees that there's a tricky tightrope to walk between expending resources on mitigation or spending it on preparation?
It's really a difficult balancing act because every dollar you spend, you can only spend once. And so, yes, it's completely understandable that we have to almost triage our response to climate change. We have to really think about where do we have the biggest benefit for society. And that's really difficult to establish because, yes, we need to react to impacts that are immediate and imminent, and we need to help people who have been affected. But we also need to do everything we can to still avoid even worse climate impact. But all of what we do cannot take away our resources and our focus on mitigating. And it's really important to stress that every fraction of a centigrade really matters.
If, as Giovanni says, technological mitigation is either too pie in the sky or rolling out too slowly, then it comes down to us to change our behaviours. But are we even capable of feeling the fear and doing it anyway? Maybe our brains are just not built for something as big and as incomprehensible as climate change.
Humans have evolved to avoid those types of really hard decisions. Oh, out of sight, out of mind. We're not going to think about that. Put your fingers in your ear, your head in the sand, because that's really hard. It's going to be really expensive, really painful, and it's going to cause all sorts of chaos.
That's next time on Preppers. If you have found any of this interesting, and I know I have because, I've been reading it and it is I'm going to be telling everyone about it. I want you to tell as many people about it as well. Or maybe even, write us a review wherever you leave reviews. It'll help us in the algorithm. Preppers is a production of the UNSW Centre for Ideas, produced and written by Sabrina Organo with production support from Cassandra Steeth, sound mix and design by Julian Vessels, and presented by me, Dan Illich. This episode was made on the lands of the Bidjigal, Gundungurra, Tharawal, Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Tabaga peoples.